Hey Internet, Elliot here for Unlock Audio, and this is going to be a quick primer into music theory. So we're going to start with the basic building blocks of traditional notation, bars, measures, different note values, rests. We're going to relate that to MIDI data and see how one translates the same information into the digital realm, and then we're going to get into some more advanced harmony and whatnot, looking at inversions, modal modulation, and typical chord progressions that we have. So if you don't really know much about music theory, this will be a really good primer for you. Let's hop in. Okay, so let's start things off with looking at the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Johann Sebastian Bach. I won't get into all the specifics of the history, but because of the lack of an easy means to spread information and whatnot at that time, he essentially not invented, but figured out the system by which we organize pitches and notes and all of that in Western harmony. And he did that pretty much on his own because he's just a total baller. So, first thing, let's look at traditional notation. In traditional Western notation, these are most of the general notes that we use. Now you can have dotted notes, which are basically a value of this note and a half of the next one. You have ties, you have triplets. And when you get into different time signatures, these notes can all mean different things. But for the sake of keeping this an intro video, we're going to assume that we are in 4/4 time, which means that the quarter note has the beat and we have 4 beats per measure. So if that's the case, then a quarter note, the one in the bottom left there, equals 1 beat. So a half note would equal 2 beats and a whole note would equal 4. All right, and you can also think of it as, a quarter note would be 1/4 of the total number of beats in the measure itself. If you look at an eighth note, which is essentially half the length of a quarter note, it would mean there are 8 of those notes in the total measure. 16th note would be half of an eighth note, so there would be 16 of those in a measure, so on and so forth for 32nd notes and 64th notes. If they tell you the duration of the note or the duration of how long the rest is where you're not playing. And all of these notes are written on what's called a staff. And the note written tells you the duration, and then where it's placed on the staff tells you the pitch for it. And for every staff, there are 5 lines and 4 spaces, and each line and space dictates a note in a diatonic scale, and I'll get into what diatonic means in a bit. All those notes are written on a staff, and then to help us essentially divide groupings of notes together and keep our place in the music, we also use measures and bar lines. So when I said 4/4 time, we're going to keep it in 4/4 time. What I'm saying is 4 beats per measure, quarter note gets the beat, and so that's what a measure would look like. And a measure is created by adding bar lines just to divide groupings of notes up. All that being said, there is more than one staff that we can use, and every one of those spaces and lines connects to a pitch, and it's great if you can just have them totally memorized. And once you live in traditional notation for a while, you definitely will. When you're first starting out and want to remember what each of these lines and spaces are, what notes they represent, here are some really good ways to remember. Every good boy does fine, or I remember when I was first learning violin, it was every good boy deserves fudge. Or if you'd rather remember the spaces, face is a good one. But this is all for the treble clef, so a higher set of notes than the bass clef, which contains a lower set of notes. So even though they may have the same notes in both staves, they correspond to the same note in a different octave. So playing the same note really low on an instrument versus the same note really high on the instrument. They're the same note, but in different registers, and they would be represented on different staves. Again, just some good tricks if you want to try and memorize what each of these notes are. Good boys do fine always. All cars eat gas. I always remember that the bottom space here below the staff is an F, and then also the 2 points here on the bass clef, well, I'll just call the colon for now, just correspond to F in the bass clef. Those are just some tricks that I use to really see, like, what note is this, where am I? So when we combine both of those staves together, you can see that they form the grand staff, with middle C literally being in between both of the staves. And you can see how they relate to each other like that. In addition to each of those notes on each stave, we also have what's called accidentals, which raise a pitch by only half a step. So let's say we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then we get back to C again. Each of those, well, actually not each of those, but many of them are what's considered a whole step apart from each other. Like we have a note called C sharp, right? And that's actually between C and D in terms of pitch. The way we would denote that is we would have our note, our C written, but then we would add our sharp symbol. And then let's say soon afterwards we wanted to play the regular C note, or C natural. We would then add that natural symbol to the subsequent note so we knew which one we were talking about. Same thing with flats. And if you want to see how they relate, here we go. Again, middle C, this is the same note. It's just showing them as part of different staves for E's. And remember that C sharp or D sharp, or even say an E flat, that's where it is on the keyboards. When we're using those accidentals, that is what we are referring to. And I also like this graphic because it shows the different octaves. We have C here, as well as C here, as well as C here. So C, 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 same note, but different register, just an octave apart. The way all of that relates to MIDI is, instead of having a note that, because of the way it's drawn, tells you its duration, MIDI visually has a longer note. And that denotes the length of the note itself. So you don't have to look at a whole note versus a half note versus quarter note. It's just however long the note is the duration of the note. So this note here begins before this note does, and it's just a longer note in general. So they overlap a bit, but that duration is longer on this note because we can visually see it's longer than that one. And additionally, there's no staves in MIDI data. It's just every single note is represented vertically. So the higher a note is, the higher it is in terms of pitch. The lower it is visually, the lower it is in terms of pitch. So there's no need for accidentals or clefs because each of these are half steps. But if you want to see how they relate to a traditional keyboard, you have what's called the piano roll here on the left. So you can see the note C, then C sharp or D flat, D, D sharp or E flat, E, F, so on and so forth. So accidentals are just not a thing in MIDI data. So now we know how all of those pieces are put together. And how they represent certain things. So what are some of the patterns that we can look for and some of the systems that we can use in the realm of music theory? Well, the first thing to look at is just scales. They are your bread and butter. So many things are built on top of them. And what's really interesting is when you get so good at scales and understanding how they work together, you can make very purposeful decisions on when you don't follow the rules of the scale to make some engaging and interesting and really cool results. But let's start with looking at a major scale. So a major scale is just based on a pattern of different pitches and the relationship between each of these pitches. It does not matter what pitch you start on, the same relationships between these pitches remains the same in order for it to be a major scale. So let's look at a C major scale here. We have a whole step, then a half step, then 3 whole steps, and finishing with a half step. You can take that pattern and start it on any single note, and it will give you a major scale as long as you keep that pattern. So, example, let's start on D. We're going to start on D to E, right? So, whole step. Then we have another whole step to F sharp, right? So, whole step, then half step to G, whole step, whole step to C sharp, and D. So in this case, we had to use some accidentals to use F sharp and C sharp in order to maintain that whole step, half step pattern. All right. C major is the only key in which, if we start our major scale on C, that we don't need any accidentals. In order to keep our pattern of whole step, half step, whole step, half step consistent, and start it on another note, we then have to add accidentals and basically tweak which notes we're going to play. And that's why key signatures exist. If we wanted to create an F major scale, so we wanted to start a major scale on F, that's possible, but then we have to actually flat our B by a half step. So it has B flat in the key signature, right? And with sharps, let's look at G major. If we wanted to use a G major scale in our piece, we would need to raise the F of the scale by a half step. So it has F sharp in the key signature there. And so all of these sharps and flats are purely there to tell us what key that we're in, to say, hey, if you want to use a major scale or a minor scale, whatever it happens to be, you need to alter the notes that you're playing in order to create our diatonic scale, right? Okay, that has been for a major scale, or what's mostly considered, like, I guess you could say, happy music, and this is how it relates to a minor scale. So all the same things relate in terms of why we have a key signature, accidentals, and all that sort of stuff, but the pattern that we're using for this scale is different than for a major scale. For a minor scale, we begin with a whole step and then immediately have a half step, and then 2 whole steps, half step, and then 2 more whole steps. So we have the same number of half steps and whole steps in the scale, but they are located at different points in the scale itself. And this scale is usually related to sad music. So if you want sad or even maybe angry sort of stuff, these a minor scale is the starting point for a lot of people in their pieces of music. We have some scales which for a minor scale don't require any sort of accidentals, like A minor here. It's actually all the exact same notes as C major. It's just that we begin playing the scale on A instead. And if we wanted to relate that to key of C, if we wanted to make it C minor, we would need to add 3 accidentals in order to create our pattern to make a minor scale possible. All right, we've got all of these scales. Let's take all of that information and move it into the realm of chords and harmony. We've been thinking about playing each of these notes successively as opposed to simultaneously. And when we get into chords and harmony, we're talking about playing these notes, for the most part, simultaneously. And typically a chord is 3 or more different notes that we play at the same time, and by it being a chord with 3 notes, we call it a triad. If you had you could call a chord with 2 notes a dyad if you wanted to, but triad is the most common, at least from an intro standpoint, the most common type of chord that we have. Things get really interesting and fun when we begin to play with playing all of these notes on top of one another, and then generating a chord from that, but then playing that chord and then following up with a different chord and playing with the different types of chords that we're using and the patterns that are dictating these chords and all that sort of stuff. But the biggest takeaway that I want you to get from this slide is the idea of consonance and dissonance. Once we get into the realm of harmony and even in playing some scales, there's an idea of creating tension and then generating like a release of tension. And there are a number of different ways that you can accomplish this, but so much of the theory behind harmony is about generating that tension and coming up with a really interesting way of then releasing that tension. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you end on the chord that you even began in on top of it. So let's take a look at that. Let's look at diatonic harmony. Now, I said we'd get to diatonic harmony a bit later in the talk, and this is where we're at. So when I say diatonic, I'm meaning adhering to the scale that you're in. So if we have a major scale here, if we were playing a major 1 chord, so a chord built off of the first note in the scale, we would play C, E, and G, because those are the 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes in that scale. If I wanted to play a D chord in the key of C major, right? So I would be playing all of the notes that adhere to the C major scale, but I would be playing those notes built off of D. I would have D, F, and A, which would actually give me a D minor chord. You can see how that relates with these Roman numerals here. I guess uppercase corresponds to a major chord while lowercase responds to a minor. Okay? If I then was still in the key of C, but then was building my chord off of the third note in the scale, or what's also called the third scale degree, so the third note in the scale, I would have E, G, and B. And again, these are all relating to the notes that are in the key of C major. So if I was just playing complete total diatonic harmony in C major, these would be the chords that I would have access to. And there are a lot of natural tendencies that these chords tend to have in patterns that we begin to recognize, which I'll get into in a bit, right? But you can see how that relates there, and you can see how all of the different Roman numerals, chord sequence, and the specific chords are here. So if I wanted to say, I'm starting on starting on the 6th scale degree of C major, that would be an A minor chord here. You can see it's basically a lowercase 6 there, A minor, and that's what that would look like. And all of this still corresponds to natural minor as well. If I was building chords off of, let's say, C minor, so this is C major, this is C minor, now we've got a couple accidentals because we're making this a minor scale, all right? Our positions of those whole steps and half steps have moved around, and that means that the actual notes that we're using here are different, and it means that the locations of major, minor, and what's called diminished chords is actually different. All right, let's look at chord progression. So chord progressions are a series of chords that establish a tonal function for each chord to produce harmonic flow. Most common chords consist of triads formed using alternate notes. C, E, G equals a C chord, G, B, and D equals a G chord. So we've got all of these different chords that we can build, and there are a lot of recurring progressions that we tend to find pleasing. Some of the most common are down here. It's like 3 chord progressions. We start on the 1, then go to the 4th chord in the progression, and then go to the 5th, and probably end back on the 1. So we've got a total of 1, 2, 3 different chords that we're playing. Even though it's a 1 and a 1, there are 3 total different chords that we're playing there. Also have circle progressions, which essentially have you starting on a 1 chord and going to a number of other different chords and eventually getting back to your 1 chord, or what kind of feels like home, or what's called the tonic in harmonic speak, I guess. And then you also have blues changes as well. So a lot of different genres have different chord progressions that tend to lend themselves to them. If you just want a cheat sheet of, hey, I'm in this key and I want to know what the different chords are that would be considered diatonic, and I just want to be able to play with them, here's a cheat sheet for you for major chords. So you can play around with, what if I do a 5 and then a 3 and then a 6 and whatever. This tells you what chords you'd be playing. And then we also have minor chord progressions as well. So if you were playing around in a minor key, this is a cheat sheet for all of the different chords that are at each scale degree for all of these different keys. So if I was in C minor and I wanted to know what the 4 chord was, C, 4, all right, so it would be an F minor chord. If I wanted to know what the 6th scale degree for F was, be F, D flat, major. So I would create a D flat major chord. You can experiment with these diatonic chords and come up with your own combinations. But now that we've talked about all of this structure that's in place in all these different scales, now I'm going to throw a curveball in there and say, at any moment, you can just not follow those rules and do what's basically and do what's called modulation or modal modulation. And this means that instead of staying within our natural minor diatonic or only within our major diatonic scales, I can have a progression where I have a bunch of chords that I'm playing around with in natural minor, and then I can just borrow a chord from the major scale as well and combine all of those. So if I were to do that, it would not be diatonic anymore if I was just looking at it strictly from the sense of, C minor. We would be borrowing it outside, like we would be using a chord outside of its scale, which has some incredible, interesting results. This is actually one of my favorite, going from a natural minor, so a minor 1 to a major 4. I just think that's a beautiful change between those two chords. And then on top of it, to complicate it even more, we've been talking about building all of these chords off of these scale degrees and just plopping them on top of one another. But that is having us remain in root position. At any moment, we can say, well, yeah, we're in C, so I have a C major chord, but what if I just take this C and put the C on top here? I've still got the same notes, it's just that this C is now an octave above. When we do that, we have the third note of the chord in the bottom, and then the fifth, and then the root. That gives us what's called first inversion. And then if we take that third note, put it on top, our fifth is in the bottom, and now we have second inversion. And depending on the function and also tonality of the chords that you're using certain chords in different inversions and in different combinations leading to other chords can sound much better using certain inversions other than others. So this is all suffice to say that wow, chords are awesome, and that may have been a huge information overload to you if you haven't delved into music theory at all, but there is a ton of options. There's a ton of rules that you can follow or choose not to follow, but I would say that it's fantastic to know how things are structured and to know that those rules exist to help you in terms of your experimentation and to help you identify ways that you can be crazy and ridiculous and ways that you can break those rules and make something really cool and interesting. I hope this talk was helpful. If any of it was super crazy and ridiculous, feel free to throw a comment below, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. If you'd like to reach out to us, it's hello@unlockaudio.com. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to stay in the loop with game audio music implementation goodness, and be sure to check out unlockaudio.com to see the cool stuff that we do for games. Thanks for watching.